There's something about the early 2000s that felt like a different era entirely. A time when a beer commercial could stop a bar full of college students mid-conversation, when two women could appear on a television screen for 30 seconds and become, almost overnight, the most talked about faces in American advertising. Diane and Elaine Klimaszewski did exactly that. And then, just as fast as they arrived, they were gone. But what happened in between, and everything that happened after, is a story about fame, controversy, politics, and the strange, fragile nature of being famous for exactly one thing at exactly the right moment. Two girls from Worcester. Before any of this, before the billboards and the football games and the Saturday Night Live sketches, there were just two sisters from a small town outside Worcester, Massachusetts. Diane and Elaine Klimaszewski were born on September 13th, 1971. They grew up in Leicester, a quiet, working-class town just a few miles outside Worcester, where their parents, both Polish immigrants, had settled after coming to the United States. Their father and mother worked as factory workers. English was not the first language in their home. Life was not easy, but by all accounts it was full of the specific warmth that immigrant families tend to build around the things that matter most: hard work, family, and the stubborn belief that the next generation will have more than the last. The girls trained in dance from the time they were 4 years old. They were, from the very beginning, a pair. They moved together, performed together, thought of themselves together. There are people who grow up as twins and spend their whole lives trying to establish a separate identity from their sibling. Diane and Elaine were not those people. They leaned into it. Their twinness was, by their own account, the thing they had always known would carry them somewhere. As Elaine later put it, they knew from a young age that they were more marketable as twins, and they simply didn't know what it was like to work separately. Their first real brush with television came in 1987, when they appeared as teen dancers on Star Search, the talent competition show that, at the time, was one of the biggest stages a young performer could hope to reach. They were 15 years old, and they performed with the kind of synchronized confidence that comes from years of practice and from never having had to think of yourself as anything but a unit. The applause they got that day was probably the first external confirmation of something they had always privately believed. By 1990, they were appearing on Let's Make a Deal, the NBC game show, working as models. The following year, they got their first credited film appearance, a small role in Problem Child 2, the 1991 comedy starring John Ritter. The film was not exactly a prestige production, but in the world of working models and actresses, you take the work that comes and you use it as a stepping stone toward the next thing. Through the 1990s, they built a quiet, steady career the way most working models and actresses do, through auditions, callbacks, small roles, and a lot of patience. They appeared in ads for McDonald's and Kodak. They landed guest spots on the soap opera General Hospital. They did the kind of work that keeps your name in circulation without making you famous, the invisible years of a career that the public never sees, where you are building skills and contacts and a sense of your own place in the industry. In 1998, they appeared in a television special called Breaking the Magician's Code, Magic's Biggest Secrets Finally Revealed, assisting a performer known as the Masked Magician in one of his illusions. It was memorable only in the sense that it was different. By 1999, they had taken a detour that nobody would have predicted when they signed up for dance lessons back in Leicester. But the detour they took before the beer commercial is one of the more unexpected chapters in their story, and it's worth spending some time on. The wrestling years. In late 1999, Diane and Elaine Klimaszewski walked into the world of professional wrestling. On November 29th, 1999, they debuted on World Championship Wrestling, the WCW, in a backstage segment, performing under the names Lolly and Pop alongside wrestlers Johnny the Bull and Big Vito Lograsso. By 2000, their ring names had been changed to Gold and Silver, and they had been folded into the WCW's Nitro Girls, the group of performers who danced and appeared during the broadcasts of Monday Nitro, WCW's flagship weekly program. It was a world as far removed from Polish immigrant factory towns as you could possibly imagine. Pyrotechnics, crowds of thousands, cameras everywhere, and a very particular kind of spectacle that American television had made enormously popular throughout the late 1990s. The WCW's Monday Nitro was, at various points in the late 90s, the highest-rated weekly program on cable television in the United States. The Nitro Girls were part of that world, present in the arena, visible on screen, part of the brand identity of a product that millions of people watched every single week. For two women who had spent a decade quietly building careers through auditions and small roles and modeling work, the scale of it must have felt significant. This wasn't a soap opera segment or a game show appearance. This was primetime cable, week after week, in front of an enormous and extremely vocal audience. The WCW was struggling by this point, losing ground rapidly to the WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, in what had been a years-long battle for ratings and audience attention known to fans as the Monday Night Wars. The twins signed with the WWF later in 2000, but the role they were meant to play was never clearly defined. They were sent down to Ultimate Pro Wrestling, a developmental territory in California where younger and newer talent was trained and evaluated. They competed there as the Power Twins. In June 2001, the Klimaszewskis were released by the WWF. The wrestling chapter was over. The WCW itself had been purchased by the WWF earlier that same year, folded into the larger organization in one of the most significant consolidations in the history of the business. The world the twins had entered was no longer quite the same world they were leaving. It had been an unusual couple of years, full of effort and ambition, but not much in the way of lasting recognition. They were 30 years old. The careers they had spent their entire lives building were, in some important sense, still waiting to happen. They had been on national television. They had been in films. They had performed in wrestling arenas in front of thousands of people. And yet the thing that would define them publicly hadn't happened yet. What happened next changed everything. And it started with two copywriters stuck in a car on a highway between Indianapolis and Chicago. The story of how the most famous beer commercial of the early 2000s was born is stranger than you might expect. The ad that changed everything. In the fall of 2001, Aaron Evanson and John Godsey were making the drive from Indianapolis to Chicago. Evanson was an art director, Godsey a senior copywriter, both working for the advertising agency Foot, Cone and Belding, which had offices in Chicago. They had been given a straightforward assignment: come up with something new for Coors Light that would resonate with men in their early to mid-20s and incorporate music. It sounds like a simple brief. In practice, it was the kind of brief that most campaigns never crack. The beer advertising space of the early 2000s was crowded and competitive, and the brands that did it well had usually found something specific and ownable. A feeling, a character, a moment. Coors Light needed something like that, and the agency needed to find it. Somewhere on that highway, Godsey's mind wandered to an old country song he'd heard as a kid, Tom T. Hall's I Love, a gentle, list-style song that worked through simple pleasures one by one. Little baby ducks, old pickup trucks, slow-moving trains, and rain. The structure was the thing. The song wasn't about any one thing. It was a collection of small, specific, honest pleasures strung together without apology. What if you kept that structure and changed the list? They worked it through on the drive. Football on TV, something every man in their target demographic understood. Gina Lee Nolin, the actress who had starred on Baywatch and was, in 2001, exactly the kind of reference that felt both current and nostalgic at the same time. Hanging out with friends. And then, the kicker, the unexpected landing. The thing that turned a pleasant enough list into something with a punchline. And twins. When they presented the idea back in Chicago, their creative director wasn't sold. Godsey would later describe the moment vividly. Evanson essentially throwing himself on the sword for the concept, arguing that it was the only genuinely strong idea they had, refusing to let it die in the room. Eventually, after some resistance, they got the sign-off. The casting call that followed led them to Diane and Elaine Klimaszewski. Their agent had sent them to the audition, and by Elaine's own account, it was one of those right place at the right time situations that you can't engineer and can barely predict. The 8 months that followed the ad's first airing, she said at the time, felt like a dream. The first Love Songs commercial aired in the spring of 2002, starring Gina Lee Nolin alongside Diane and Elaine, who appeared at the end to deliver the now famous final note. Coors Brewing Company, based in Golden, Colorado, had one immediate reaction. According to those who were present, Leo Keeley, the president of Coors at the time, watched the finished spot and offered a single word of feedback. Twins. The ad went on air. And then something happened that nobody in advertising can fully plan for. It became part of the culture. Reports came back almost immediately from across the country. A group of students at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor had stopped talking mid-conversation in a bar to belt out the jingle together when it came on screen. The "and twins" punchline became a shorthand, a catchphrase, something people said in contexts that had nothing to do with beer or Coors Light or football. It spread the way things spread in 2002, through word of mouth, through bars, through conversations, before social media existed to accelerate or distort any of it. Coors reported internally that the Love Songs campaign was generating the highest audience scores of any advertising in the company's history. That is a significant statement for a company that had been selling beer since 1873 and had produced decades of marketing over that time. By the fall of 2002, the ads were airing during NFL broadcasts every weekend, one of the most expensive and coveted slots in American television advertising. By February 2003, they had earned the Saturday Night Live treatment, which is, in the American media landscape, the clearest possible signal that something has become so well known that it can be parodied without explanation. Jennifer Garner and Rachel Dratch played conjoined twins in a sketch that everyone watching apparently understood immediately and without context. Diane and Elaine were invited to sing the national anthem at sporting events. They appeared in Maxim. They launched a fashion line called Zipper Girls. They talked in interviews about a music album in progress, a project called Clone, and about a sitcom based on their lives that was in development. They ran their own website. They were, in the specific way that fame worked in the early 2000s, everywhere. On television during football, on magazine covers, in conversations in bars, on billboards around Colorado that were reportedly causing drivers to slow down. The Boston Globe ran a profile of them in February 2004, describing how they had doubled the fame of their hometown. That was the peak. And peaks, by definition, are where the descent begins. What the ads were accused of, and what that backlash looked like, set the tone for everything that came next. The backlash begins. Not everyone watching those commercials was charmed. A USA Today poll, conducted in 2003, measured audience reaction to the Love Songs campaign and found that the ads carried a dislike score of 22%, significantly higher than the average dislike score of 13% for television advertising at the time. Among women, the numbers were markedly different from those among men, where 29% of men reported liking the ads a lot. Only 16% of women said the same. The campaign was named the most misogynistic advertisement of the year by a women's advocacy group. Godsey, speaking about it years later, pushed back on that characterization. He described the concept as a kind of self-aware joke at the expense of a certain type of man, a meathead singing about the things he loved, which happened to include football and identical twins. That was the tone it was meant to have, he said. The mockery was aimed at the guy in the song, not the women in the frame. Whether or not that reading holds up is something people have debated for 20 years. Then came the scary movie problem. In 2003, Coors agreed to sponsor Scary Movie 3, the third installment in the horror parody franchise. The Klimasowski twins appeared in the film, playing exaggerated versions of themselves in a cameo. Diane later described the experience as a kind of peak moment. They had been so embedded in the culture that they were spoofing themselves on a movie screen. It felt, she said at the time, like they had truly arrived. The problem was the rating. Scary Movie 3 was rated PG-13. The first two films in the franchise had both been rated R. The anti-alcohol advocacy group known as the Marin Institute, later renamed Alcohol Justice, saw the rating as a direct signal that the movie was being aimed at younger audiences, and they mounted a public campaign against Coors, writing directly to Coors' CEO Pete Coors and calling on the company to stop using films that attracted teenagers to promote alcohol. The Marin Institute's complaint described the Coors Light twins' role in the movie as part of a broader pattern of alcohol marketing directed, however unintentionally, at underage viewers. Coors cancelled at least one commercial that had incorporated footage from the twins' appearance in the film, and the company declined to pursue a similar promotional tie-in with Scary Movie 4. A civil lawsuit was filed around the same time, naming Coors among several alcohol companies accused of seeking profits from marketing to underage drinkers, with the twins' Scary Movie 3 connection cited as part of the evidence. The company had no public comment on the litigation. Diane and Elaine, for their part, maintained that Coors had always acted responsibly and that they hadn't been paying much attention to the controversy. The careers they had built their entire lives toward were moving, and standing still to argue about lawsuits didn't seem like the priority. But a much larger storm was forming, and it had a name on it: Pete Coors. The moment Pete Coors announced he was running for the United States Senate, the twins became something they had never expected to be: a political issue. The Senate race and the collapse of the campaign. Pete Coors was, in the spring of 2004, the chairman of the Coors Brewing Company. He was the great-grandson of Adolph Coors, the company's founder, and the son of Joseph Coors, who had been instrumental in founding the Heritage Foundation, one of the most influential conservative think tanks in American political history. Pete Coors was born in 1946 in Golden, Colorado. He had graduated from Cornell University with a degree in engineering, later earned an MBA from the University of Denver, and had spent essentially his entire adult career at the family business, rising to vice chairman and CEO in 1993, before being named chairman of both the Coors Brewing Company and Adolph Coors Company in 2002. In March 2004, he announced that he would be seeking the Republican nomination for the United States Senate seat in Colorado, which had opened following the retirement of Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell. Within days of that announcement, the coverage had already turned toward the twins. Colorado newspapers began running pieces examining the tension between Pete Coors' stated values. He was presenting himself as a conservative candidate, opposed to gay marriage, aligned with traditional family positions, and the reality of what his company had been airing during NFL games for the past 2 years. The Rocky Mountain News ran an editorial in April 2004, just 1 week after Coors had officially entered the race, noting that at least 4 separate newspaper columns had already drawn attention to the contradiction. The piece noted that the pressure was likely only beginning. The criticism came from multiple directions at once, which was the particular trap Pete Coors found himself in. His conservative base had concerns about the suggestive nature of the Twins' campaign. The idea that a candidate emphasizing family values was simultaneously the public face of advertising that women's groups had called the most misogynistic of the year was difficult to reconcile. Those on the other side of the political divide had their own set of objections, some overlapping with the conservative concerns, others distinctly their own. And then there was the complication that the company had already extended beyond beer commercials. The Scary Movie 3 controversy, still fresh from 2003, added another layer to the picture being painted. A company that had been sued over allegations of marketing alcohol to underage audiences, now helmed by a man asking Colorado voters to trust him with a Senate seat. The Coors company itself made an extraordinary decision. It began distancing itself from its own candidate. In July 2004, the brewery ran its own advertising, clarifying that Pete Coors' campaign reflected his personal views and not the positions of the Coors Brewing Company. This was, in the history of American corporate political entanglement, a genuinely unusual thing to witness. A family company publicly separating itself from its own name, running advertisements to clarify that it and its chairman were not one and the same. The Love Songs campaign was discontinued in 2004. Godsey, one of the campaign's creators, said plainly in later interviews that the political pressure had effectively ended it. The ads hadn't run their natural course. They hadn't been replaced by something fresher. They had, in his words, died a political death. Pete Coors' conservative base had found them indefensible, and the campaign was quietly pulled rather than allowed to become a daily debate point. Pete Coors won the Republican primary in August 2004, defeating Bob Schaffer with 61% of the vote. But the general election was another matter. He faced Democrat Ken Salazar, the state's popular attorney general, in November and lost 51% to 47%. It was one of only 2 Democratic Senate pickups in the entire country during the 2004 elections. Colorado, which had been rated a likely Republican hold at the start of the year, had flipped. How much the Twins controversy contributed to that outcome is impossible to measure with any precision. There were many factors in that race, but the ads had made a difficult campaign harder, and their discontinuation during the race had not made the issue go away. It had simply confirmed that the issue was real enough to act on. Pete Coors returned to business life after the election. In May 2006, he was arrested by the Colorado State Patrol on suspicion of driving under the influence, registering a blood alcohol level above the legal limit. It was a brief news item, notable primarily for the irony of its context. For Diane and Elaine, the political storm had passed, but the campaign that had made them famous had gone with it, and the world they returned to was quieter than the one they had stepped out of 2 years earlier. After the lights of the campaign went out, the twins tried to keep moving. What those next few years looked like is worth understanding. The years after. The period between 2004 and 2006 was not without activity for Diane and Elaine Klimasevsky. They took on film work, small roles in a string of low-budget comedies and parody films that leaned heavily on their established image. They appeared in Drop Dead Sexy in 2005 and in Date Movie in 2006, among others. The roles they were given in these productions often amounted to variations on the same persona they had played in the Coors ads. The twin joke, the visual punchline, the pair of identical women deployed for comic effect in a scene that didn't ask much more of them than to appear and be recognizable. The film work was sporadic, and the productions were modest. None of these projects matched the scale of what they had been doing 2 years earlier. Being in a parody film is a very different thing from being the most recognized faces in American beer advertising. The audience that had stopped conversations in bars to sing along with a jingle on television was not the same audience buying tickets to see Date Movie on a Friday night. The music album they had been developing, the project called Clone, never materialized. Diane spoke about it in interviews with a mixture of frustration and pragmatism, attributing the delays to the unpredictable machinery of the music business rather than any problem on their end. The label hadn't released it. That happened. The fashion line, Zipper Girls, didn't develop into the ongoing enterprise they had hoped it might become. The sitcom based on their lives, which had reportedly been in development with involvement from producer Damon Wayans, also never made it to air. That kind of development limbo is extremely common in television. Projects are attached, discussed, shopped around, and then quietly set aside when the timing doesn't work or the financing doesn't come together. But the accumulation of things that didn't come together tells its own story about where their momentum had gone. The last credited acting work for both sisters, according to available records, was Date Movie in 2006. After that, the public trail goes genuinely quiet. Elaine Klimaszewski married a man named Tyler Goldman in Deer Valley, Utah, and the marriage was reported in early 2007. From that point forward, neither sister appears to have pursued public professional engagements in modeling, acting, or media. There are no campaigns, no credited roles, no reported appearances. What exists, as of the mid-2020s, is an occasional social media presence. Under the handle at Top Beast Twins, the sisters have periodically posted comments about sports, golf and basketball mostly, as recently as 2024. It is a glimpse of ordinary life, entirely detached from the world they once occupied. Two women in their early 50s talking about basketball on the internet is a long way from two blonde sisters singing the national anthem at an NFL game. The transition from the highest scoring campaign in Coors history to private life in Utah and wherever Diane settled is not a story of catastrophe. Nobody lost everything in a dramatic fall. There were no public scandals beyond the ones that surrounded the brand, rather than the individuals themselves. There was no courtroom drama, no public breakdown, no cautionary tale in the traditional sense of that phrase. What there was, instead, was a very particular kind of ending that is in some ways harder to explain. The gradual, undramatic conclusion of a moment that had been very intense and then simply stopped. The world kept moving. The twins moved with it, quietly and out of view. But the story of the Coors sisters isn't just about two women stepping back from public life. It's also about the broader world they inhabited, and what it said about that particular era in American advertising and culture. What the Coors twins meant. Looking back at the early 2000s from any kind of distance, the Love Songs campaign lands in a very specific cultural moment. It was a time when the advertising industry was still operating on assumptions about its primary audience that would, within a decade, come under serious and sustained scrutiny. The idea of building an entire campaign around a particular kind of male fantasy, presented cheerfully, even self-consciously, almost as a parody of itself, was not unusual then. It was, in many ways, the standard approach for a category of products that had long defined their audience as young men and built everything around that definition. Beer advertising in the early 2000s was not subtle. Budweiser had its frogs and its Clydesdales. Miller Lite had its ongoing arguments about great taste versus less filling. Coors Light had the twins. Each campaign was a concentrated effort to become the thing a particular kind of man thought of when he thought about beer. And each one did it through images and sounds and feelings that were designed to feel familiar and easy and appealing to that specific person. The Klimaszewski twins didn't create that world. They found it, and it found them. They were working models and actresses who had spent over a decade building a career before a chance audition led them to a beer commercial that happened to catch fire. None of the culture around that commercial, the backlash, the political complications, the debate about what it said about women in advertising, was something they had engineered or intended. They were performers doing a job, and the job had consequences none of them could have foreseen from the room where the audition took place. What the ads also captured, without anyone necessarily intending this, was a version of early 2000s America that felt very sure of itself. The NFL on weekends, the Baywatch references that still landed, the humor built around a certain type of man who liked simple things and wasn't embarrassed about any of it. That version of America has not entirely disappeared, but the advertising world that served it so directly has changed substantially. The commercials that replaced the twins era were increasingly commercials trying to speak to everybody, broader, more cautious, more deliberately inclusive in ways that the Love Songs campaign made no effort to be. Whether that shift has made advertising better or just different is a conversation that tends to go in circles. The people who loved the Coors Light ads loved them for exactly the reasons the people who hated them found them objectionable. The same clarity of intent that made them effective was the thing that made them a target. There is also something worth noting about the timing of the backlash relative to the campaign itself. The ads ran for about 2 years before the political dimension of the Pete Coors Senate race brought them to a wider kind of scrutiny. During those 2 years, they were enormously successful by every measurable industry standard. The audience scores were the highest in Coors history. The brand was being discussed in bars and on sports television and in magazines. The parodied version on Saturday Night Live aired in early 2003, over a year before the campaign ended. What that suggests is that the ads themselves were not inherently unsustainable. They might have run another year or two and gradually faded the way most advertising campaigns do, replaced by the next thing, remembered fondly by the people who had been in their target demographic. Instead, they were caught in the crossfire of a political race that needed them to disappear, and they disappeared. The ending was premature in a way that felt unresolved, as if the story got cut off before it reached its natural conclusion. For Diane and Elaine, that premature ending meant that their peak moment was defined not just by what the campaign was, but by how it ended. They became famous, and then the thing that made them famous became inconvenient for the company they represented, and the company moved on without them. That is not an unusual experience in the world of advertising. Campaigns end, faces change, brands evolve. But when the ending is driven by a Senate race and a political controversy, rather than by the ordinary passage of time, it leaves a different kind of mark on the story. Where the story ends. Diane and Elaine Klimaszewski are, as of the mid-2020s, private individuals. They are in their early 50s. They grew up in Leicester, Massachusetts, as the youngest children of Polish immigrants who worked in factories and did not speak English when they arrived in the country. They trained in dance from the time they could walk. They spent over a decade grinding through auditions and small roles and an unusual side career in professional wrestling before a car ride between two ad agency employees produced the idea that made them famous. For about 2 years, really, from the spring of 2002 through the end of 2004, they were among the most recognized faces in American advertising. The campaign they anchored was parodied on Saturday Night Live, referenced in Colorado newspaper editorials, discussed in Washington Post columns and Boston Globe profiles, cited in a lawsuit, and ultimately discontinued because a candidate for Senate found the association politically damaging. That is a remarkable amount of consequence for a 30-second beer commercial. The Coors Brewing Company continued without them. Coors Light remained one of the best-selling beers in the United States for the years that followed, eventually merging with Molson to form Molson Coors, and later combining with Miller Coors. The brand outlasted the campaign and its era by decades, as large brands tend to do. The Love Songs ads became a nostalgic artifact, the kind of thing that surfaces in retrospective articles about the early 2000s and generates comments from people who remember exactly where they were when they first heard "and twins" shouted in a bar. Pete Coors remained a figure in Colorado business and conservative political circles. He wrote opinion pieces about the beer industry. He donated to political causes. He moved through the post-Senate world the way most wealthy businessmen with political ambitions that don't fully materialize tend to do. Still present, still connected, but no longer at the center of the story. The advertising people, Aaron Evanson and John Godsey, moved on from Foote, Cone and Belding to other agencies and other campaigns. When they spoke about the Love Songs ads 15 years after their debut, there was a quality of genuine affection in how they described the whole thing. The drive between cities, the idea that almost didn't make it out of the room, the reaction from the University of Michigan bar, the Saturday Night Live parody. They were proud of it. They thought it was good. They found its ending by political pressure genuinely unfortunate, in the way that any creative person finds it unfortunate when the thing they made gets taken away from them for reasons that have nothing to do with its quality. And somewhere in all of that, in the gap between the moment when two sisters from Leicester, Massachusetts, became something that every bar in America recognized, and the moment when they simply stepped back into private life, there is a story about the fragility of a particular kind of fame, the kind that is built on one thing, in one era, aimed at one audience, using one medium. When any of those elements shifts, the structure beneath the fame shifts with it. When all of them shift at once, when the campaign ends, the political winds change, the internet era begins, and the cultural moment passes, there is very little left to hold on to. Diane and Elaine Klimaszewski took the audition when it came. They did the job with everything they had. They became, for a genuine moment, part of the American cultural fabric, the kind of presence that gets parodied on national television, that stops people mid-sentence in bars, that ends up cited in congressional race coverage as a symbol of everything a candidate needs to answer for. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. And then the moment passed. The commercials stopped airing. The films dried up. The projects didn't come together. The years moved forward in the way that years do regardless of what anyone has accomplished or hoped for. Two women who had grown up dreaming of being stars, who were the daughters of factory workers and the products of small-town Massachusetts, and years of dance training and patience and ambition. They stepped back into ordinary life. There's something almost nostalgic about all of it, about the simplicity of what their peak moment actually was. A jingle, a punchline, a pair of identical faces at the end of a 30-second spot about football and beer, and the very specific, uncomplicated pleasures of being young in the early 2000s. The world that produced that commercial and made it a cultural touchstone is not entirely gone, but it is far enough in the rearview mirror now that it feels like a different time. Because it was. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. In May 1956, three brothers sat down together at Perino's restaurant in Los Angeles for what was supposed to be a celebration. They had agreed to sell the studio they had built together over 30 years. They were going to retire at the same time, the way their parents had always told them to do everything, together. 2 weeks later, the oldest brother discovered what had actually happened, and from that moment, the family was over. What the Warner Brothers built from nothing is one of the great American stories. What they did to each other is something different, something that never quite made it into the films they made, but that people who knew them personally never forgot. This is the story behind the studio. Four brothers from nowhere in particular. The Warners did not come from money. They did not come from influence. They came from a village called Krasnosielk, in what is now Poland, where their father Benjamin was a shoemaker who understood that the world his children were being born into had no future for a Jewish family in the Russian Empire. Benjamin Warner made his way to Baltimore in 1888, ahead of his wife Pearl and their children, who followed a year later on the steamship Herman. The family name, Wonsal, or Wonskolasse, depending on the record, became Warner somewhere in the immigration process, and Warner they stayed. Baltimore was where they first tried to take root. It was where Benjamin struggled in the shoe repair business, and where Pearl added children to the household with regularity. But Baltimore did not hold them for long. Following a friend's advice, Benjamin uprooted the family again and tried his luck in Canada, attempting to make a living bartering tin goods with fur trappers. That venture failed too. The family moved back to Baltimore, had more children, and then in 1896 followed Harry, the oldest son, the one who always went first, to Youngstown, Ohio. There were many children in the Warner household. Benjamin and Pearl had 12 children across their marriage, though not all survived into adulthood. The four who matter to this story were born across a span of 11 years. Harry, born December 12, 1881, in Krasnosielk. Albert, born July 23, 1884, also in Poland. Sam, born August 10, 1887, in Krasnosielk. And Jacob at birth, born August 2nd, 1892, in London, Ontario, during the family's short and unsuccessful detour into Canada. Youngstown, Ohio. In the 1890s was an industrial steel town, unglamorous and ungracious, but full of people like the Warners, immigrant families who had arrived in America with very little and were in the process of figuring out what that meant. Harry set up a shoe repair shop. He was 15 when they arrived, and already the functional head of the family's economic life in a way that shaped everything about how he understood responsibility. From the beginning, the brothers divided along temperamental lines that would define them for the rest of their lives. Harry, the eldest, was serious, morally rigid, and shaped to his core by the immigrant experience, by the memory of what his family had fled, and the conviction that everything they had built in America could be taken away if they were not disciplined and careful. He was the one who held the businesses together, who kept the books straight, who asked what their parents would think before making a decision. He was not an easy man to work for or to argue with, but he was consistent, and consistency was its own form of trust. Albert, known as Abe in the family, was the steady one, reliable, financially sound, comfortable in the background, and willing to do the work without needing the credit. He had an easy temperament that allowed him to move between Harry's rigidity and Jack's flamboyance without being destroyed by either. He managed distribution, handled the numbers, and kept himself out of the newspapers by choice. Sam was the dreamer, the technician, the brother who became genuinely electrified by new things, not in a scattered, dilettante way, but with the focused attention of someone who could see what a technology was going to become before anyone else around him could. His interest in film was not casual. It was the kind of sustained fascination that drives people to build industries. And Jack, the youngest, nearly 11 years behind Harry, was the showman, the entertainer, the one who had no particular gift for numbers or management, but who understood, instinctively and completely, what an audience wanted. At the family's first theatre, Jack sang between films to clear the house for the next screening, a role so minor it barely exists in most accounts of the family's rise, but one that captures the essence of who he was. He was performing from the very beginning. He could not stop. In 1903, Sam got hold of a film projector and a print of The Great Train Robbery, an early silent short that was drawing curious crowds wherever it played. He and Albert took it on the road to carnivals in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Sam ran the projector. Albert sold tickets. The business was modest and unpredictable, and completely fascinating to both of them. Harry joined the operation in 1905, providing the business structure and the family authority that Sam and Albert's roadshow needed to grow into something more permanent. Jack, still young, was part of the travelling show when he could be, filling whatever role was needed, learning the business from the ground up, the way all of them had learned everything, by doing it. They opened their first real theatre, the Cascade, in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, in 1906. Harry managed the business end. Albert handled the money. Sam worked the equipment. Jack sang between screenings and watched the audience's faces when the picture came on. It was a functional arrangement. Every brother had a role. Every brother contributed. Every brother was necessary. That arrangement, four completely different personalities building one thing together, held for years. Looking back, the remarkable thing is that it worked as long as it did. Building something from nothing. The early years of the film business were not gentle. Thomas Edison had accumulated a collection of patents covering nearly every aspect of motion picture production and distribution, and he used them aggressively, forming the Motion Picture Patents Company in 1908, which charged distributors' fees that made it nearly impossible for independent operators like the Warners to survive. The brothers had been expanding steadily, acquiring 15 more theatres in Pennsylvania by 1907, and establishing themselves as a real presence in the regional exhibition business. Then, Edison's trust tightened its grip, and the economics of what they were doing became untenable. They sold their theatre business in 1910 for $52,000. Decent money, but still the end of something they had built with considerable effort, and regrouped. They worked briefly distributing films for independent filmmaker Carl Laemmle, who was leading his own fight against Edison's monopoly. In 1912, they broke with Laemmle to form their own production company, Warner Features. Harry set up offices in New York with Albert. Sam went to Los Angeles to run the company's West Coast division. Jack went to San Francisco. The division of labor that would define Warner Brothers for decades was already taking shape. Harry and Albert in the East, handling finance, sales, and distribution. Sam and Jack in the West, actually making the films. It was a natural division along the lines of who each brother was. Harry and Albert were businessmen. Sam and Jack were producers. Their first real break came when Harry secured the rights to turn a book called My 4 Years in Germany, written by former US Ambassador James W. Gerard, into a film. It was released in 1918, as the country was still processing the war, and it connected with audiences in a way that generated real profit. That money funded a move to a proper studio in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard. The brothers relocated the studio from Culver City to Sunset in the early 1920s, and on April 4th, 1923, following the success of a comedy called The Gold Diggers, Warner Brothers Pictures, Incorporated, was formally established. Harry was president, Albert was treasurer, Sam and Jack ran production. Those early years of the official studio had an unexpected hero, a German shepherd named Rin Tin Tin, rescued from a World War I battlefield by an American soldier named Lee Duncan and trained to perform in films. Rin Tin Tin became one of the most popular draws in American cinema through the mid-1920s, carrying the studio through lean years when human stars alone might not have kept the lights on. His films were reliable earners at a time when reliability was exactly what the studio needed. There is a widely repeated story, possibly embellished, but too vivid to leave entirely aside, that Rin Tin Tin received the most votes in an early Academy Award ballot for Best Actor, and that the Academy quietly redirected the award to a human candidate to preserve the ceremony's dignity. Whether or not the full story holds up, the underlying truth is clear. For a period in the mid-1920s, a dog was the most bankable asset at one of Hollywood's studios, and the Warners were pragmatic enough to be grateful for it, and probably too proud to say so more than once. By 1925, despite Rin Tin Tin and their other output, the studio was in serious financial difficulty. The mid-decade slump was hitting independent studios hard, and the Warners were spending more than they were earning. Sam had been watching the development of a new technology, a sound synchronization system called Vitaphone, developed by Western Electric's Bell Laboratories, and he believed it could change everything. He presented the case to his brothers. Harry was skeptical, and his skepticism was not unreasonable. Sound seemed like a gimmick. Audiences had been coming to silent films for 20 years. The major studios, MGM, Paramount, First National, Universal, were watching the Vitaphone demonstrations with interest, but declining to move. Why would the audience demand something they had never had? Sam would not let it go. He pushed. He argued. He had seen the technology work, and he believed in it with the same focused certainty that had made him the family's most reliable judge of what would matter. Eventually, with the studio bleeding money and facing genuine collapse, Harry gave way. In June 1925, Warner Brothers signed an agreement with Western Electric to develop Vitaphone jointly. Sam oversaw all of it: the equipment, the testing, the recording sessions, the implementation. He was doing what he had always done, absorbing himself completely in a technology that was going to change things, and driving it forward through the sheer force of attention he was willing to give it. In 1926, they released Don Juan, a feature film with a fully synchronized musical soundtrack, though without spoken dialogue. The film received a cautious reception. Harry grew nervous again. The old studios watched and still declined to move. Sam and Jack pressed on. What came next would be The Jazz Singer. And what happened the night before it opened is the part that never gets enough time in the histories of what the Warners built. The night everything changed. And who wasn't there? The Jazz Singer was not simply the first film with synchronized dialogue. It was the moment the entire film industry pivoted on its axis. And it happened because four brothers from Youngstown, Ohio, were willing to bet everything on a technology that the largest studios in the country had decided to wait out. Al Jolson starred. The story was simple: a cantor's son torn between his Orthodox Jewish heritage and his love of popular music. but the effect of hearing a human voice come from the screen was unlike anything audiences had experienced in 20 years of moviegoing. The film opened on October 6th, 1927, at the Warner Theatre on Broadway in New York City. The lines stretched around the block. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Box office records fell. The studio that had been fighting for its survival became, almost overnight, one of the most important in the world. Sam Warner never saw it. In September 1927, while he and Jack were still completing production on The Jazz Singer, Sam began experiencing severe headaches and persistent nosebleeds. By the end of that month, he could not walk steadily. He was taken to California Lutheran Hospital in Los Angeles, where doctors diagnosed a serious sinus infection aggravated by abscessed teeth. The infection had spread further than they initially understood. They discovered it had reached his brain, a mastoid infection that had developed into osteomyelitis and then into epidural and subdural abscesses. The surgeons operated, then operated again, then again, and a fourth time. Sam never came out of the coma that followed the final procedure. He died on October 5th, 1927, one day before the premiere of the film he had made possible, at 40 years old. Harry, Albert, and Jack attended the New York premiere the following evening. They had buried their brother that morning in Los Angeles. They sat in the theater that night, a theater named after their family, in the city their family had helped make into the center of the entertainment world. And the audience around them had no idea that the men who had built what they were watching were sitting among them in grief. Sam's loss reshaped the family in ways that went beyond the grief of losing a brother. He had served a function within the Warners that none of them fully recognized until it was gone. Sam was the peacemaker, the brother who had always stood between Harry's controlling severity and Jack's constant rebellion, absorbing the friction between them and keeping the working relationship functional. Without him, there was no buffer. There was no one to stand in the middle and remind both sides what they were supposed to be building together. In the years that followed Sam's death, the relationship between Harry and Jack deteriorated steadily. It deteriorated through the 1930s, when Jack's personal life became a source of public embarrassment for the family Harry was trying to protect. It deteriorated through the 1940s, when Jack's cooperation with government investigators put him at odds with Harry's principles. It deteriorated through the early 1950s, when Jack began making decisions about the studio's assets that Harry learned about through the trade press rather than from his brother. And then, in 1956, it broke. The studio in its golden years, and the family fractures behind the screen. The 1930s were the decade in which Warner Brothers fully became itself. While MGM was the studio of glamour and escapism, all tuxedos and gowns and carefully constructed dreams that gave Depression-era audiences somewhere beautiful to disappear. Warner Brothers was something more uncomfortable, more honest about the world that existed outside the theater doors. Warner Brothers made the gangster film into an art form. Little Caesar in 1931, with Edward G. Robinson as a ruthless, small-time criminal clawing his way to the top of a Chicago underworld. The Public Enemy the same year, with James Cagney in a performance so physically raw and threatening that it genuinely alarmed audiences who were not prepared for it. These were not stylized fantasies of crime. They were drawn from newspaper headlines, from the real texture of American cities during Prohibition, and they made the case that the country's social fabric was in genuine trouble. Harry's moral instincts drove this. He believed films could educate and challenge as well as entertain, and the studio's output through the 1930s was consistently willing to say things out loud that other studios managed in softer language. Bette Davis became the studio's signature star, and her relationship with the studio was one of the defining creative tensions of Hollywood's golden era. Davis was brilliant, demanding, and unwilling to accept the mediocre scripts and formulaic roles that Jack Warner preferred to assign. She fought constantly for better material. In 1936, frustrated with the projects she was being offered, she travelled to England and attempted to work outside her contract. Jack Warner sued. The British courts ruled in Warner's favour. Davis returned to Hollywood having lost the legal battle, but having made clear, to everyone paying attention, that she was not a woman who was going to be managed without a fight. The studio's other major creative figures had similarly complex relationships with Jack. He was feared by his employees in a way that Harry and Albert were not, described as unpredictable, given to humiliating people in front of others, and possessed of a sense of humour that landed badly as often as not. His son, Jack Warner Jr., later said that his father existed behind a wall of his own construction, and that much of what was behind it was not particularly pleasant. Harry and Albert were considered, by the studio's employees and actors, to be fair in their dealings. Jack was something else. The brothers' personal tensions broke into the open again over Jack's second marriage. He had married his first wife, Irma Solomon, in 1916, and they had a son, Jack Warner Jr., together. Through the 1930s, Jack conducted a long and open affair with an actress named Anne Page. In January 1936, he divorced Irma and married Anne. The extended Warner family, Harry, Albert, the siblings and relatives, refused to attend the wedding. They refused to accept Anne as a member of the family. Harry sent Jack a letter on his wedding day expressing, in terms that left nothing open to interpretation, his feelings about what Jack had done and who he had done it to. The marriage and the family's response to it deepened a rift that was already decades old. Harry had always related to Jack as the youngest, the unpredictable one, the one who needed managing, the one whose instincts ran toward pleasure and showmanship in ways Harry found hard to respect. Jack had spent his life pushing back against that treatment with a force that grew rather than diminished over time. And yet, on the question that mattered most in the 1930s, the brothers were united in a way that the rest of Hollywood was not. Warner Brothers was the first major studio to close its German office after the Nazis came to power, doing so in 1934. Their German representative, Joe Kaufman, had been killed, attacked on the street in Berlin. The studio pulled out. No other major Hollywood studio did so for years. Harry, whose entire life was built on the foundation of what his family had escaped from in Eastern Europe, understood personally what was growing in Germany. He used the studio's resources to say so when most of his contemporaries preferred the business of neutrality. In 1939, Warner Brothers released Confessions of a Nazi Spy, the first explicitly anti-Nazi film produced by a major American studio, more than 2 years before the United States entered the war. The studio received threats. The German government protested formally. Harry went ahead. On this, Jack followed his older brother's lead. Whatever was broken between them in the private sphere, when Harry was right about something important, Jack knew it. That window of unity closed after the war. The late 1940s brought a new pressure that the brothers handled in entirely different ways. In October 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee convened its infamous hearings into alleged communist influence in the Hollywood film industry. Jack appeared as a cooperative witness. He named names, screenwriters, directors, studio employees he identified as communists or communist sympathizers, in testimony that delighted the committee and horrified many of his colleagues. He even offered to pay for the deportation of anyone found to hold communist views. It was, by the standards of the industry, an extraordinary act of self-preservation dressed as patriotism. Harry was appalled. He had spent the 1930s using the studio's platform to fight fascism, to make films that named what was happening in Europe when other studios looked away, to protect the kind of Jewish immigrant family that his own family represented. The idea that the studio he had built on stories about working people being crushed by corrupt systems was now being used to help a government committee do exactly that kind of crushing. It was a rupture in his understanding of what the family's work had been for. Jack had a different philosophy. Jack had always been, at his core, a survivor. He understood power in the way of a man who had grown up watching his older brother exercise it, and he had learned to navigate rather than resist. His appearance before the committee was his navigation. Whether he regretted it later is not entirely clear from the record. What is clear is that the schism it created between him and Harry never healed. Through the early 1950s, the personal and professional tensions between them became increasingly difficult to contain. Jack was making decisions about the studio's assets, selling the pre-1948 film library being only the most visible of them, that Harry learned about from the trade press rather than from his brother. The working relationship had become a formal arrangement between two men who no longer trusted each other, and the formality was wearing thin. By 1956, it was gone entirely. The betrayal at Perino's. By the early 1950s, the cracks in the Warner Brothers working relationship were deep and structural. Jack had been making decisions about the studio's assets that Harry found out about after the fact, through the press, rather than through his brother. One of the most painful was Jack's decision to sell the studio's pre-1948 film library, decades of work, hundreds of titles, to a company called Associated Artists Productions for $21 million in early 1956. Harry learned about the deal from others. When word reached him, his response, according to people who were present, was that of a man who had watched something essential be discarded. He said that the library was what they had worked their whole lives to create, and now it was gone. Against this backdrop, Jack began making the case for collective retirement. He told Harry and Albert that it was time, that they had all earned it, that they had given the business 50 years, that their parents had always taught them the family would prevail if they stayed together, and that staying together now meant going out together. The argument was well made. It appealed to exactly the values that Harry had always carried: family solidarity, honouring the parents who had brought them here, the idea that there was something more important than individual advantage. A group of investors had approached the brothers with an offer. The group was organised by Serge Semenenko, a banker at First National Bank of Boston, working alongside financier Charles Allen. They were offering $22 million for 800,000 shares at $27.50 per share, a substantial sum that would leave each brother financially secure for the rest of their lives. Jack, who had previously rejected a similar offer, now said he was willing to go forward, on one condition. They had to sell at the same time, all of them together. It was the condition that would have made Harry trust him. It was the condition that was designed to. On May 14th, 1956, Harry, Jack, and Albert gathered at Perino's restaurant in Los Angeles to mark what they believed was a shared decision. Perino's was one of the city's most elegant restaurants, the kind of place where important things were celebrated. They toasted what they had built over more than 3 decades. 3 men in their 70s, at the end of something enormous. What Harry and Albert did not know, what Jack had been carefully arranging without telling them, was that Jack had simultaneously organized a separate syndicate to purchase a controlling interest in the company. Through the same transaction, by which he was nominally selling his shares alongside his brothers, Jack had maneuvered himself into the position of the company's largest single stockholder. By the time the deal was fully finalized in July 1956, Jack Warner had appointed himself president of Warner Brothers Pictures, the position Harry had held since the company's founding in 1923. Harry found out the way he had been finding things out about his brother for years, not from Jack. He read about it in Variety. According to Harry's granddaughter, Cass Warner, who documented the family history in books and a 2008 documentary called The Brothers Warner, Harry suffered a heart attack almost immediately upon learning what had happened, followed by a stroke. He had to walk with a cane for the rest of his days. At his funeral 2 years later, in July 1958, Harry's wife, Rhea, stood before the people gathered and said that Jack had killed him. Jack did not attend. Harry and Jack had one final encounter. Jack showed up uninvited at Harry's 50th wedding anniversary, where Harry was already in a wheelchair and unable to speak. The only thing Harry could do was cry. After that, there was nothing. Albert never spoke to Jack again either. The deal at Perino's, the dinner that was supposed to be a celebration, that appealed to the family values Harry had always been the guardian of, had been the final act in a relationship that had been under strain for decades. The studio they had built together, the name their father had given to this family when he arrived in America with nothing, remained. The family that had built it was gone. 3 brothers, 3 endings. Harry Warner lived for 2 more years after the sale. He had suffered a heart attack and a stroke in the immediate aftermath of discovering what Jack had done, and spent the rest of his days walking with a cane. He was 74 when the betrayal happened. He was 76 when he died on July 25th, 1958, at his home in Los Angeles. Jack did not attend the funeral. There are accounts that suggest his absence was deliberate rather than merely logistical, that he was available, or could have been, and that his choice not to come was the final statement in a conversation that had been going on between the 2 brothers since childhood. The people who gathered to bury Harry Warner, the man who had turned a shoe repair shop in Youngstown, Ohio, into one of the most powerful studios in the history of American entertainment, did so without the youngest brother present. Harry's wife, Rhea, stood at the graveside and said, to the people who were there, that Jack had killed him. Nobody argued with her. Albert Warner lived 9 more years. He died on November 26, 1967, in Miami Beach, Florida, at 83 years old. He was, by that point, the last of the older 3. Harry gone for nearly a decade. Sam gone for 40 years. He had lived quietly after the sale, as he had lived through most of the studio years, without making noise, without offering public comment on the things that had happened, without ever speaking to Jack again. What Albert made of the betrayal is largely unrecorded, because Albert made a practice of keeping his inner life out of the public record. He had always been the one who balanced the books and stayed out of the newspapers. He maintained that discipline in the aftermath of 1956 with the same consistency he had always brought to everything else. He died, as he had lived, without drama. By the time Albert died, the studio had already changed hands. Jack sold his controlling interest in Warner Brothers to a production company called 7 Arts Productions in 1967, the same year Albert died. The deal yielded him, after taxes, somewhere in the range of $24 million. Jack reportedly quipped, afterward, that he never would have imagined a butcher boy from Youngstown ending up with that kind of money in his pocket. He had a gift for the line that made people laugh, which had never entirely translated into a gift for understanding when not to use it. 2 years later, in 1969, 7 Arts sold the studio to the Kinney Corporation, a conglomerate that had started in parking lots and funeral homes and was now making its way into entertainment. The Kinney chief, Stephen J. Ross, would eventually build it into Time Warner, which merged with Time Inc. in 1990, to become one of the largest media companies in the world. None of that was Warner family business any longer. Jack Warner spent his final years as an independent producer, based partly in Los Angeles and partly in the south of France. He continued producing, most notably the film adaptation of the musical Camelot in 1967. He attended parties, collected social company, gambled in the south of France with the enthusiasm he had always brought to any game where he might win. He was, by the accounts of people around him in these years, restless in a way that comfort and money did not soothe. His niece Betty Warner Scheinbaum told a reporter, years later, that Jack had never really had friends, that the people around him were there because of what he represented, rather than who he was. She said he had always sought out society, and always seemed vaguely uneasy and defensive once he was inside it. His son, Jack Warner Jr., was long estranged. The relationship with his wife, Anne, was one in which they had lived parallel lives for decades, bound together by legal and financial structures rather than warmth. Those who knew Jack in retirement noted that his restlessness had a quality to it that resembled a man who had made certain choices and was still, at the end, discovering their full cost. He died on September 9th, 1978, in Los Angeles. He was 86 years old. He was the last of the four brothers. What remained? By 1978, the year Jack died, Warner Brothers had been through 4 sets of owners since the brothers had left it. The studio that Harry had incorporated in 1923 with a loan from his banker, Motley Flint, was now a subsidiary inside a media empire that would eventually stretch from film to television to music to magazines to cable to digital. It was one of the most consequential cultural institutions in American history, and its films, The Exorcist, Blazing Saddles, All the President's Men, Blade Runner, the Superman franchise, had become part of the permanent vocabulary of the culture. What had not survived was the family. Sam, the visionary who made the talkies possible, who fought his brother Harry for years to pursue a technology the rest of the industry thought was premature, and who finally won that argument only to die the night before his proof arrived. Sam died 40 years before Jack, at 40 years old, in a Los Angeles hospital, while the film he had given everything to finish was about to change the world. He never heard the applause. Harry, who had carried the family across the Atlantic in his imagination before he ever made the physical crossing, who had built the business from Ohio carnivals and a Cascade movie palace with borrowed undertaker's chairs to the presidency of one of the great studios in Hollywood history. Harry died cheated by the youngest brother he had spent a lifetime trying to manage. He died with a cane he needed because of the stroke that the shock of betrayal had caused. His wife said Jack killed him, and the people who were there believed her. Albert kept his counsel, as he had always done. He died without speaking to Jack again, after more than a decade of silence that was its own form of verdict. He had been the steady one, the one who handled the numbers, who never needed the spotlight, who had been in this thing from the very beginning when he sold tickets to the great train robbery at Ohio carnivals in 1903. He outlived Harry by 9 years and the studio's family ownership by just months. He died in Miami Beach in the November of the year the family name left the building for good. And Jack outlived them all. He had the studio, the money, the years, more years than any of his brothers, and spent them in ways that suggest he had not quite solved the problem of who he was when the studio was not there to define him. He was still seeking an audience. He was still, at his best, a showman without a show. The company his family had built still exists. It still bears the name that Benjamin Warner gave his family when he arrived in Baltimore from Europe, with nothing but a trade and the determination to use it. The WB shield goes on the screen before films seen by hundreds of millions of people on every continent in every language. It outlasted every one of the men who made it. But the story of how it was made, the Ohio carnivals, and the borrowed chairs, and the four brothers who divided the world between them according to who they were and what they were good at, that story belonged to specific people in a specific time. And those people are all gone now, gone in different ways, on different terms, with different things left unresolved between them. What Benjamin and Pearl Warner brought out of Krasnoselsk was more than a family. It was the raw material for something that the whole world eventually watched. They could not have known that. Nobody could have. What the four brothers made of it is one of the great American stories. What they did to each other, the distances that opened between them over 50 years, the sale at Perino's that ended everything, the funerals that the living did not attend. That is the part of the story that the studio itself never managed to put on screen. Not because it wasn't dramatic enough, but because some stories are too close to tell, honestly, even for the people who lived them. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.